Welcome back to the Paranormal State, Washington, and UFO UAP. With Makāula Nakae, a lifelong experiencer and ET contactee since 1990. Today's episode, 1950 Project Magnet, Canada, 1950 to 1954. When Ottawa tried to catch a flying saucer with a compass. While the United States Air Force was busy building a towering, high-grade bureaucratic paper shredder to furiously pretend that UFOs were nothing more than swamp gas, weather balloons, and collective psychosis, our polite neighbors to the north took a wildly different, astonishingly based approach. Instead of panic-driven denial, institutional gaslighting, or treating military pilots like they had lost their minds after a rough night in the mess hall, Canada decided to use actual science. Established in late 1950 by the Canadian Department of Transport, Project Magnet stands as one of the rarest, most delightful anomalies in the entire history of ufology. A genuinely government-backed, academically supported investigation that treated anomalous aerial phenomena, not as a public relations nightmare to be swept under the rug, but as a legitimate, high-frontier puzzle of geophysics, advanced propulsion, and atmospheric mechanics. Every great scientific rebellion starts with a man who is willing to look foolish for the sake of the truth, and Project Magnet was entirely the brainchild of Wilbur B. Smith. Smith was a senior radio engineer with the Canadian Department of Transport, a man who was equal parts brilliant, credentialed scientist and unapologetic cosmic visionary. He wasn't some fringe basement dweller, tossing together conspiracy theories between sips of instant coffee. He was a respected, level-headed technical mind who understood the hard realities of telecommunications, radio propagation, and atmospheric physics. By 1950, Smith had become utterly convinced, not by pulp fiction paperbacks or late-night campfire stories, but based on official diplomatic communications, commercial aviation logs, and his own rigorous, independent atmospheric research that unidentified craft were physically real, intensely structured, and operating on principles that made modern mid-century physics look like a toddler playing with wooden building blocks. Somehow, armed with a potent mix of Canadian charm, unflappable diplomatic tact, and relentless scientific logic, Smith managed to convince his government superiors of something radical. That the Crown had a moral, strategic, and scientific obligation to figure out how these machines worked before some other superpower accidentally blew up the hemisphere, trying to rever-engineer them. He wasn't asking for permission to chase ghosts. He was demanding permission to investigate a very real, very uninvited guest in North American airspace. What made Project Magnet truly revolutionary and head and shoulders above the pedestrian inquiries of its American counterparts was its core hypothesis. While Washington was hopelessly tied up in a petty, offensive turf war arguing over whether saucers were secret Soviet toys or little green men from Mars, Smith completely bypassed the sociological noise and looked straight at the immutable laws of nature. He zeroed in on geomagnetism. Smith and his small, dedicated team hypothesized that these mysterious, high-speed craft weren't burning fossil fuels, spraying jet exhaust, or relying on clumsy internal combustion. Instead, they theorized that the saucers were tapping directly into the Earth's natural magnetic grid, essentially hitching a cosmic ride on invisible lines of geomagnetic force. By interacting with the planet's magnetic field, these craft could easily achieve those jaw-dropping, G-force-shredding, right-angle turns that made conventional military pilots want to retire, sell their uniforms, and take up knitting. To test this wild, paradigm-shifting theory, Smith didn't just sit around an office waiting for someone to spot a glowing light over a hockey rink. He established a dedicated, permanent, and fully instrumented research station at Shirley Bay, just outside Ottawa. Shirley Bay was designed to act as an atmospheric tripwire. Armed with a bizarre, cutting-edge assortment of magnetometers, gravimeters, cosmic ray detectors, and custom-tuned radio receivers, the station was a marvel of mid-century scientific preparedness. Rather than waiting for visual sightings, the station actively monitored the invisible magnetic and electromagnetic heartbeat of the sky, hunting for subtle, anomalous disturbances that correlated with civilian or military UFO sightings. It was, quite literally, the world's first true scientific observatory, built exclusively to catch the invisible, physical footprint of the unknown. So, what did Project Magnet actually catch during its 4-year scientific stakeout in the chilly Canadian wilderness? Smith's private conclusions were, to put it mildly, enough to give a traditional university physicist a massive coronary. In a famously candid, top-secret 1950 internal memo that eventually leaked into the harsh, unforgiving light of history, Smith dropped an absolute geopolitical bombshell. He flatly stated that the technology behind these craft was vastly superior to any that we have, and noted, with a touch of dark bureaucratic irony, that the entire subject was classified higher than the hydrogen bomb. Think about that for a moment. The Canadian government had quietly concluded that flying saucers were more sensitive than the ultimate weapon of mass destruction. Naturally, the buttoned-down political and scientific establishment back in Ottawa wasn't quite ready to throw out their university textbooks, rewrite the laws of thermodynamics, and start worshiping magnetic disks in public. As the years ticked on, mounting skepticism from mainstream bureaucrats who vastly preferred predictable, low-risk budget lines over chasing invisible magnetic waves and interstellar anomalies began to severely choke the project's funding and administrative support. By 1954, Project Magnet was quietly defunded, the Shirley Bay station wound down its operations, and Smith's meticulous, groundbreaking reports were tucked away into a dusty filing cabinet to be forgotten by the mainstream world. Project Magnet remains a shining, slightly tragic monument to the road not taken in human history. It proved, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that a sovereign government could approach the UFO mystery with open-minded scientific rigor, empirical data collection, and intellectual honesty rather than knee-jerk ridicule, close-minded denial, and institutional gaslighting. Though it ultimately ended without capturing a flying saucer in a butterfly net or unlocking free anti-gravity for the masses, Project Magnet left behind a profound, enduring blueprint for humanity. It delivered a timeless reminder. When a civilization is faced with the ultimate frontier of the unknown, the most embarrassing, cowardly, and short-sighted response isn't failing to find the final answer on the first try. It's stubbornly refusing to look through the telescope in the first place. The global UFO panic of the 1950s. Everyone else was looking to and panicking just as much. While Canada was busy building magnetometers at Shirley Bay and the United States was busy inventing new ways to say swamp gas, the rest of the post-war globe was not sitting around quietly knitting. If you thought America's frantic, closeted obsession with flying saucers was a lonely American affliction, you've got another thing coming. The dawn of the 1950s triggered a genuine cross-border planetary freakout. From the rain-slick streets of London to the paranoid corridors of the Kremlin, foreign intelligence agencies, ministries of defense, and brilliant, eccentric scientists were all staring up at the sky, realizing with mounting dread that sovereign airspace had just been permanently invaded by things that didn't give a damn about international borders or radar lock. Let's take a brisk, deeply cynical, and mildly terrified tour across the mid-century globe to see how other nations handled the cosmic wake-up call. 1. Great Britain, tea, crumpets, and top-secret flying saucer working parties. You have to hand it to the British. When faced with the potential collapse of human dominion over the skies, their immediate instinct was to pour a nice cup of tea, draft a deeply polite memo, and form a committee. The Flying Saucer Working Party, 1950 to 1951, sad-faced Britain's Air Ministry and Ministry of Defense, quietly assembled a secretive group of scientists and intelligence wanks to evaluate the mounting wave of RAF sightings. Their conclusion? Utter, unvarnished skepticism wrapped in peak British understatement. The Working Party officially decided that UFO reports were merely a mix of optical illusions, astronomical phenomena, and hysteria. They famously concluded that investigating them further was a waste of time because, in a wonderfully arrogant display of post-imperial bravado, if the Russians didn't have them, and we didn't build them, they simply couldn't exist. Of course, the British government kept investigating them in secret anyway for the next 50 years, because deep down, MI5 knew perfectly well that the sky was full of things that refused to respect the Union Jack. 2. France. The birth of Japan and the French approach of elegant curiosity, while the Anglo-Saxons were busy either shredding documents or scoffing over teacups. The French decided to approach the absurdity of the UFO phenomenon with a uniquely Gallic blend of philosophical dread and rigorous bureaucratic intellectualism. In the late 1940s and 1950s, The French Air Force, Armée de l'Air, was quietly logging thousands of baffling, cigar-shaped and disc-shaped incursions over French soil. But unlike their American counterparts, French military brass didn't launch an immediate campaign of aggressive gaslighting. They just archived the weirdness with a collective, sophisticated shrug. This eventual realization that you can't just bully physics away led France to become the only major Western government to maintain an official, open, state-funded scientific agency dedicated to studying UAPs, which eventually evolved into JPAN under the space agency CNES. While Washington was busy pretending saucers were weather balloons, France looked at the data and essentially said, well, this is deeply irregular and terrifying, but let's measure it with a ruler anyway. 3. The Soviet Union: psychotronics, secret capsule tests, and paranoia. If you think American and Canadian bureaucrats were paranoid about flying saucers, imagine running a totalitarian regime where acknowledging an uninvited object in your airspace meant admitting that your multi-billion-dollar air defense network was basically a collection of expensive lawn sprinklers. Throughout the early 1950s, official Soviet media treated UFOs with absolute stony silence. Mentioning flying saucers in Pravda was a fast-track ticket to a lovely re-educational vacation in Siberia. Behind closed doors, however, the Soviet military-industrial complex was losing its collective mind. KGB archives and military flight logs from the era reveal that Soviet interceptor pilots were regularly scrambled to chase glowing spheres and metallic disks over the Baltic and the Urals, frequently with orders to fire on them, resulting in a few terrifying, quietly buried dogfights. Much like their American rivals, Soviet researchers eventually pivoted away from pure aerodynamics and dove headfirst into parapsychology, psychotronics, and mind control research. Desperately trying to figure out if these anomalies were Western superweapons, psychological operations, or something genuinely cosmic. 4. Post-war Germany and beyond, the rocket scientists left behind. By 1950, Germany was a fractured, smoking ruin partitioned between East and West. But its legacy in advanced rocketry and aerospace engineering cast a very long shadow over the global UFO craze. Because Nazi Germany had genuinely experimented with radical, disc-shaped aircraft prototypes, like the Bell and various experimental Flugscheiben, both the CIA and the KGB spent the early 1950s aggressively hunting down ex-Luftwaffe engineers, suspecting that every glowing disc spotted over Washington or Ottawa was just a runaway secret weapon built in a hidden Black Forest bunker. As it turned out, the German engineers were just as baffled by the saucers as everyone else, leaving the intelligence agencies to realize an even more unsettling truth. These things weren't leftover Nazi tech. They were performing maneuvers that made German rocketry look like a kid throwing a balsa wood glider off a porch. A planet united in confusion. When you zoom out and look at the global landscape of the early 1950s, a hilariously consistent picture emerges. Humanity was desperately trying to strut around like the undisputed masters of the universe, having just survived the most destructive war in history and proudly entering the atomic age. And right on cue, the universe sent an uninvited guest to hover over our nuclear silos, buzz our radar screens, and pull off 90-degree turns at Mach 9, just to remind us how hopelessly outmatched we really were. Every nation handled the existential crisis in its own distinct cultural style. The Americans panicked and built a paper shredder. The British drank tea and called it mass hysteria. The Canadians built a magnetic tripwire in the woods. The Soviets threatened to send the pilots to the Gulag. The French poured a glass of wine and took notes. Yet beneath all the differing bureaucratic flavors of denial, panic, and pseudoscience, every single government shared the exact same secret terror. We are not alone in our own skies. And we haven't the slightest idea what to do about it. To be continued. Watch and listen. Watch the cinematic video trailer. Listen to the full podcast now. Explore the archive Cosmic Awakening Volume 1, 1991, Peru, Journey into the Unknown. Sacred Valley of the Incas. Volume 2, Ascension 2012, The Golden Alchemy. Part 3, The First Contact and the Paranormal State. Join the journey. New episodes drop periodically. Each chapter delivers a tight, hyper-focused 10 to 30-minute exploration into the evolution of ufology, perfect for your daily plunge into decoding hidden messages from outer space, designed to raise awareness and foster human evolution. Subscribe to support your inner development. Thumbs up to help push our channel through the algorithm. Comment below. Share your thoughts on today's episode.